All right, you ready for this?
Ready.
Hey everyone, this is Tom Salemi. Welcome to this episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast. This is a very special episode, special because it's the first one that we've really recorded on the road. I was actually on the road. I was in Las Vegas attending Medmarc's annual broker meeting. They invited me and my guest today, Kwame Ulmer of Ulmer Ventures, to share some time on stage to sort of review some of the issues impacting the medtech industry. Kwame and I focused on things that have come to pass over the past 2 years and wanted to really understand their longer terms, or at least discuss their longer term impact. So this week's episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast will review parts of my conversation with Kwame. Will be from the stage at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Las Vegas. But I also followed up with some folks in the medtech industry who could speak more intelligently than me about the issues that I brought up. So we will open up with Kwame. We'll find out about his story. We'll talk about his work to improve fairness and equity in the medtech workforce and his work with Medtech Color. And then later on, we'll bring on some additional guests to talk about the state of medtech financing. We'll hear from John Norris of Silicon Valley Bank. We'll learn about the latest of the MCET rule, which of course would give Medicare reimbursement for devices that obtain breakthrough designation from the FDA and are approved by the FDA. I'll talk to Mark Leahy about that. He is the CEO of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association. And then finally, we'll explore the rise of teleconnectivity. I'll talk with Jennifer Freed. She is the CEO of Explorer Surgical. She'll walk us through the story of the company just a bit, but more to the point, explain how COVID impacted her company and how Explorer's recent acquisition by DHX puts it into a great position to succeed. But before we begin this conversation, I want to bring in our sponsor, Medmarc. Medmarc, once again, was kind enough to bring me out to Las Vegas and put me in position to lose some money at the blackjack table. So very grateful for them, and I'm grateful that they're sponsoring this podcast. I'm speaking today with John Agello. John is Vice President of Marketing and Business Development at Medmarc. John, tell me a little bit more about Medmarc. What do you folks do?
Medmarc is a specialty insurance carrier focused on medical technology and life sciences companies. Founded over 40 years ago by members of the world's largest medical technology association, Medmarc companies offer products liability and completed operations insurance, as well as manufacturers' errors and omissions insurance for the creators and distributors of medical devices, diagnostics, dental products, pharmaceuticals and biotech, personal hygiene products, as well as animal health devices, drugs, vaccines, and nutritional supplements. While Medmarc offers insurance policies in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, our insurance coverage is global in nature. We insure medtech products around the world and defend our insureds in both domestic and foreign courts.
That's excellent. We'll hear more from John a little later in the podcast. If you want more information about Medmarc, go to medmarc.com. That's medmarc.com. All right, let's start this podcast episode. First, I'm going to cut out my little intro from on stage. Frankly, I rambled on a bit, and I actually got a little emotional. It was great being in front of people, and it was great seeing Kwame Ulmer. I felt like I hadn't seen him in a long time, and then I came to realize later that Kwame and I had actually never met. This was one of those connections that you make via Zoom and during the lockdown. So it's great to meet him in person for the first time, and it was great to sit in front of a crowd for the first time. It was really quite exceptional. But I started this conversation, as I do with every conversation on this podcast. I asked Kwame Ulmer how he found his way into the medtech industry. Oh, and one more thing. The microphones at the start of the conversation were lapel mics. They didn't work quite well. We were ultimately and very quickly switched over to handheld mics. The sound gets much better. So if things sound a little low at the start, stick with us, please. It's going to sound great. All right, let's hear from Kwame Ulmer of Ulmer Ventures.
Yeah, so I guess it starts in graduate school where I was looking for programs that somehow had a relationship to biomedical engineering. And this was 20 years ago. my graduate advisor says, this material, nitinol, it's going to have a lot of applications in the medical device industry. It was kind of like that old movie, Plastics, my friend. Exactly. That's the future, plastics. I trusted him. It turns out that I got a job at the FDA, and my main job was to review devices that had nitinol in it. So that was my segue. Ended up loving the breadth and depth of the work at the FDA. So spent 12 years there, and then transitioned to a role in corporate America at a medical device manufacturer. But my start is a little unusual. It was at the FDA.
Yeah. How did you choose that route? I don't think I've talked to anyone who started at the FDA, but I have to imagine it's been an invaluable perspective to have.
It is. My first thought, a lot of people who join the FDA think, I'll go for a couple years just to get exposed, and then I'll leave. But I ended up falling in love with the city of Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. I ended up meeting my wife there. So that's a good reason to want to stay there. Sure. And towards the middle of my time there, all these amazing reforms started kicking in. And we'll talk about it later, but Jeff Shorin started instituting these reforms that made it really an exciting place to be. Mm-hmm. We brought in some outside experts to help us rethink how we regulate in the United States. And these are really people of stature from the startup community. We had a retired general who was in this group. But things like that kept me interested, and I was there for 12 years.
And it was really, and we will get into it later, but it was a real critical time for the medical device industry. It was not what it is today. We'll just say that and leave it there for now. So you were deputy director until 2014, and then you moved to
Danaher. Yeah, got out to LA.
How did you? I love to explore those points where someone says I can do this or I can do that. What made you just decide to do that?
I was in business school, and this particular business school, University of Virginia, Darden's Business School, had a real strong emphasis on forward progress and motion. So it was a great environment for me and I was encouraged to think about my next step that was meaningful. And quite candidly, I had an interest in investing. Mm-hmm. And the advice I had received was to be a good investor, you should have some time as an operator working in a medical device company. And the other side of it is I had always, by that time, after 11 years at that time, I learned how to evaluate other people's work. I wanted to get exposure and get time actually building products. Mm-hmm. So it was an obvious next step for me. And that's how I decided, those two factors.
Those are good reasons. And you went from Danaher to Wavemaker, which was a venture firm. So it didn't take you very long to go where you wanted to go.
Yeah, it's been a journey. It's been a wonderful journey, and each step has prepared me for the next. So interestingly enough, we're meeting with a dental implant company just last night as a potential investment, and spent 4.5 years at the FDA evaluating dental implants, and then 3.5 years at a dental implant company. So conversation.
That's great.
So you found your way to Wavemakers. Bring us up to date now. You're at Ulmer Ventures. Yep. Tell us about that, and let's get a little bit about your work with UCLA.
Yeah. So I split my time between serving as a venture partner at Wavemaker 360 Health, where I lead the Medtech practice. So I'm fortunate enough to work with a team that has over 50 years of Medtech experience. We source traditional medical devices and diagnostics, diligence them, negotiate terms. And we're closing in on approximately 8 investments total over the last 3 years that are traditional medtech or diagnostics that we've been involved in. Ulmer Ventures is a classic regulatory strategy consulting firm, and and we're going to talk about it more. I spend time with a lot of digital health companies and helping them navigate the FDA. So because of my time at the FDA, I serve as a coach when they have their first pre-submission or if they want a quality review of their application. And that's what kind of led to a relationship with Jennifer McCaney, which I know we'll talk about, UCLA. The research there.
I have all these questions that are popping up that I think I should save for our bullet point discussion. But I guess one that I have is, it's a question I ask physicians who leave
who stopped being a doctor, worked as a CMO at an industry. I talked to Ken Stein at Boston Scientific, asked him sort of what kind of takeaways he had from that transition. And he made an interesting point that he wishes that folks in industry understood that most physicians really do, want what's best for the patient. They want the technology that works best. On the flip side, he wished that more physicians understood that folks in industry really do want what's best for the patient, that there was just more trust. Oh, that's my word, not his, but that each understood the other's perspective better. I'm curious from your perspective at the FDA, in industry now, what do you tell people about folks at the FDA? And conversely, if you run some old colleagues, what do you tell them about folks who are in industry?
Yeah. So if I'm candid, when you're at the FDA, the beauty of it is it's mission oriented.
Yep.
And the people there really are focused on the mission of protecting and promoting public health. There at times can be a blind spot because when I was at the FDA, there was a relatively small number of people who had industry experience and didn't have a deep appreciation. For one, the people on the other side want the same thing. Mm-hmm. They want to reach patients in a meaningful way. So there could be a little subtext of self-righteousness at the FDA. We are the last line of defense before these products go to patients. And when you go to industry, you realize the inordinate amount of time focused on a high quality process for development of a product, 21 CFR 820, all that good stuff, quality management system. So I think it's healthy if more industry people accept things like FDA site visits, which is a common practice of the FDA. I wish there was more funding for that, so FDA folks can actually meet with industry and tour sites to get more exposure to what it's really like there. And I hope that more industry people consider a stint at the FDA so that there's more cross-fertilization. It's a wonderful place at the FDA, highly educated staff. They ask really cogent, pressing questions. And the last thing I'll say is I would love it if industry viewed the FDA as an organization that 9 times out of 10 are asking questions that will help you make a better product. And it's not a barrier. And we'll talk about what we found a little bit at a high level of the perceptions now that industry has of the FDA.
We'll take another quick break from this conversation to bring back John Agello of Medmarc. John, now that our listeners know who Medmarc is, what distinguishes Medmarc's insurance offerings from other life science carriers?
Good question, Tom. At Medmarc, you get more than an insurance policy underwritten and customized to your needs. Our insureds benefit from our claims professionals who specialize in products liability for life sciences companies. And we work with a national panel of attorneys well experienced in defending third-party liability suits. And through our insurance broker distribution partners, Medmarc staff attorneys and FDA compliance professionals offer risk management solutions designed to respond to the industry's particular needs, including risk evaluations, employee training, contract reviews, and FDA compliance consulting.
Great. Now let's wrap this up. This is your opportunity to tell our listeners why they should choose Medmarc as their product's liability carrier.
Tom, since our founding, Medmarc has insured over $1 trillion in global sales of medical products. From companies in the early clinical trial stage to multinational manufacturers with over $1 billion in sales, we exist to protect our insured's reputations, their products, and their balance sheets. We even have insured products that have literally been out of this world, tested and used in space on the International Space Station. Choosing Medmarc means that you will benefit from our customized and comprehensive products and services, allowing you to focus on what you do best: create, sell, and support world-class medical products. At Medmarc, we exist to protect you, the life sciences industry.
That's great, John. Thanks again for having me out in Vegas, and thank you for sponsoring this podcast and for making it possible. If you want more information about Medmarc, once again, you can go to medmarc.com. That's medmarc.com. All right, this is Podcast Mike Tom. I'm back to tee up this next part of the podcast. We're going to speak to 5 different areas in medical devices that have been impacted over the past 2 years, not just by the pandemic, but by world-changing events like the killing of George Floyd. So we'll review these 5 different areas separately. And in some cases, Kwame will speak to them when he spoke to them on stage. In areas where I sort of took the lead, I phoned some friends and I got them to offer their more expert insights. But let's start off with Kwame Ulmer. Kwame and I began talking last year to discuss his organization, Medtech Color. In this next segment of the podcast, Kwame will introduce Medtech Color and he'll talk about how things have changed or if things have changed in the medical device industry. Let's listen.
We're an organization, 501c3, Medtech Color, that has a simple mission, and that is to advance the representation of persons of color in the medical device industry. And we drew a lot of inspiration from what I like to call a sibling organization, Medtech Women, that started before us. They have a very similar focus because there's a gap in the leadership ranks, and we'll show some data, such that there's value that's being missed when organizations don't have more diverse leaders in their organization and sitting on their boards, et cetera. We want to build community, and we've built a community of 1,500 persons via LinkedIn, email, and our in-person events. And these are allies and people who want to have mentors, people to support them in their journey in medtech, people from underrepresented ethnic groups. We also want to just dramatically increase the number of people of color who enter and stay in the industry. And we have some programs to do that. And I'll talk about that. And then we want to actually facilitate strategic relationships that have an impact in the ecosystem. And I'll talk about that some in a minute. So here's the data. The blue bar are white employees. This is taken from Bureau of Labor Statistics at different levels in the organization. Orange and gray are African Americans and I believe Hispanics. And we see a gap. This is not representative of America. Medtech Color is a national organization focused on the US. And the way we view this is a missed opportunity to add value to your company, the top and bottom line. So what does that mean specifically? We've had speakers like Ulmer and Kevin Lobo talk about their specific aims to increase the number of women on their board and leadership roles, because they believe the McKinsey data that says when you have these people in these leadership roles, you drive top and bottom line. So that's why we do this. And driving top and bottom line translates to reaching more patients. So specifically, we have these strategic imperatives. We want to diversify clinical trials. November 9th, we had our first webinar in conjunction with the FDA to give companies tools to have more ethnic groups in their clinical trials. We want to create 100 new Black and brown CEOs. We had a pitch competition where we invested $100,000 in early stage companies that are managed and controlled by Latinx or African American people. Our goal for 2022 is to increase that from 100K to 250K. And then the last effort is increase the number of people who enter and stay in the organization. And we do that through a networking breakfast. We have it every year in conjunction with the MedTech Conference, AvaMed. And we've had speakers like Ulmer come and talk about the importance of managing, this was pre-pandemic, managing a large organization. And Brooke Story, who runs a $1 billion business for BD, talked about some elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but she spent a lot of time talking about the impact of digital health and the pandemic on digital health. So I talked about this before. This is our networking breakfast. Brooke was kind enough to join us as a keynote speaker. The next one will be in Toronto. You're all invited. It's a mix of folks. Kevin Lobo comes every year. We're joking that we're going to have a seat with the plaque for him to just be there every year. Mick Farrell from ResMed joined last year. And we just love everyone from the ecosystem to come. The collaborative community, I talked about it. It's a wonderful multi-stakeholder organization. To add to the FDA, the American Medical Association sits on there. MDMA, Mark Lee is an active participant in collaborative communities, and it's all about getting more and better representation in clinical trials. I talked about our pitch competition. What's exciting is our corporate sponsors are hand selecting members of our top 10 to enter into their corporate accelerators. J&J, we're in discussions with J&J and having potential members of our top 10 be accepted into their J Labs. ResMed selected someone for their corporate accelerator. We've just solidified a partnership with Harvard's Catalyst program. And our top 10 winner this year was the top winner at Medtech Innovator, which is the world's largest global accelerator. And that was a real proof point for us. Someone, a Latinx leader, she's running a stroke detection company, won the top prize in the largest accelerator in our industry. So we're just over the moon, enthusiastic about the opportunity there.
I just interviewed her yesterday.
Oh, outstanding.
She'll be on the podcast in a couple of weeks. Yep.
This is our leadership. It's reflective of the industry. I like to joke that our first C-check came from Danaher, my old employer, and Ernest Adams is that former Danaher employee. He works for Polo now. We're still trying to get some free shirts out of him, but we haven't been able to secure it. But it's just an exciting team, and it's growing. So what's next for us? I mentioned it, but I'll just reinforce it. We're going to have our pitch competition in 2022. It'll be in March, and it's going to be in lovely LA. And we're going to invite investors to come have one-on-one sessions with our top 10 winners. Collaborative Communities is launched. We're going to have 3 times the programming we had in 2021 and 2022. And professional opportunities. There's a gentleman I had a conversation with exploring. He's African-American director at a medium-sized company. He's looking for opportunities for a senior director role. So I pointed him to our professional opportunities section of our website so he can get access to potential new role for him in the organization. And these are ways, if you have relationships with companies that want to get involved, these are ways that you can connect with us. We're really excited about the future, and we just love to have more partners on board. So that's Medtech Color in a nutshell.
That's great. No, it's a great organization. As someone from the media who I've always tried to make an effort to bring in different voices and people who look differently. It's this organizations like this and MedTech Women make it so much easier just to shine them up, because we go through our day, trying to find articles and stories and people to interview for podcasts. And that was great. I interviewed the winner of your pitch contest.
Yes, you did. Yes.
I talked to Sandra yesterday. It's just been really wonderful to have an entity like this that is just holding these people up high for the world to see and allowing us to help tell their stories. So I'm grateful that this all came together. How are you feeling about, you mentioned Mick Farrell, you mentioned Kevin Lobo. How are you feeling about the industry's move during, it coincided with the pandemic, but I think the killing of George Floyd really started things, at least started a deeper conversation that was already ongoing. How has the industry, from your perspective, and if you want the perspective of Medtech Color, how has it moved forward since then? How are you feeling?
So tangibly, we're seeing more heads of diversity, equity, inclusion, with my perception, still modest budgets. Mm-hmm. We are seeing some CEOs who are full-throated, focused with targets. They're not afraid of having targets. Kevin Lobo is a good example of that. He said, I'm going to have more women leaders in my organization. I'm going to have more diverse board. And I think he has a finance background. He just focused on it like a laser and got it done. My honest assessment is the scope and scale of the commitment is modest. And I'll give you an example. Medtech Color, and this is just 2 benchmarks. Medtech Color is a sub $1 million nonprofit. By any measure, it's a modestly sized nonprofit. You know what the size of the industry is. That's one benchmark. On the other end of the spectrum, there's a nonprofit, a trade association in California, CLS. They got their corporate sponsors, and it's for the life sciences industry. Some of you may be familiar with California Life Sciences. They used to be called CLSA. They made a $3 million commitment to this effort. I think the commitment has to be tangible and then in the multi-millions, and it will look different for different organizations. And that's where we need to get as an organization. The one last thing I will say is the 2 main trade associations, national ones in our organization, Mark Leahy has been a strong partner, and AdvaMed has been an incredibly strong partner. They have a framework for how to improve the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization. I think there's an opportunity for more CEOs like Kevin Lobo to really 10x their impact and their focus on it.
Interesting. And Kevin, I talked to him last June. We talked specifically about increasing diversity. And he had mentioned that at Stryker, they hadn't had an organization representing Asian employees, even though his family is from Asia. So they created that. But he also mentioned that prior to that time, diversity certainly included race, but a lot of the attention was on women, which is equally important. And it really sort of broadened the scope as to what diversity looks like. And we had some numbers in terms of women representation. We have Medical Design and Outsourcing is our printed magazine, and we have an episode. We have an issue called Women in Medtech, where we highlight women leaders or leaders who are women in the medical device industry, and we also track the top 100 companies and monitor their or aggregate data about their executive boards and their leadership. And the numbers we had in 2019 was 18% of senior leaders were women. That went up to 20% in 2020 and 21% in 2021. So it's a slow move in the right direction. Are you getting a sense that there's a slow move in the direction when it comes to representation of people of color?
Yeah, and I think the right word is slow. That's the right, what's that adjective? I don't say this often. I view this as a multi-generational effort. This is our contribution to this effort in a $100 billion industry. And given the size of our industry and the makeup of America, there's a unique opportunity to put more focus on this. And it could be incentives in the health economics and reimbursement space that companies say, look, we recognize the browning of America. We recognize that, the emerging markets are not necessarily Europe anymore. There are other places in the world, and we're going to get ahead of this, and we're going to incentivize this. This is not an idea I came up with. I was talking to Carl St. Bernard, and he talked about a role for health economics groups actually in this effort as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but this is our contribution. And I think we are positioned to help large and small organizations get better.
Do you think we need a separate, one of the conversations that came up that, I always thought about this as a workforce issue, but then the issue about clinical trials came up. And I was surprised, frankly, at the underrepresentation in clinical trials. It's certainly part of the same larger problem, but it's a different part. Do we need an organization to focus on that aspect? And Medtech Color works on workforce, or are you taking that all on?
We are taking it on, and startups are taking it on. It's fascinating. There's we call it DMV. There's a Maryland-based startup that I met with 2 days ago. It's a digital health company. Their entire business model is to enroll more African Americans in clinical trials. That's their business.
Wow.
And they say 2% of African Americans enroll in pharma trials, et cetera. They have an interesting way to monetize that. So everybody makes money in relationships with HBCUs and the Divine Nine, which is Black fraternities and sororities. So those are two interesting ways that we could get at it. Now, if another nonprofit wanted to rise up that's only focused on diversifying clinical trials, I wouldn't be opposed, because we're one player in an ecosystem and it's all good work.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that was our discussion about equity and fairness in the medtech workforce. Next, we're going to talk about financing. First, let's hear again from Kwame Ulmer. Kwame is investing heavily in digital health, and he'll explain why in this clip. But Kwame, to my point about, or my question about how is investing changed during the pandemic, where, I know people are making pitches over Zoom. That's all well and good, but more than that, how has the infrastructure or the ecosystem changed considerably over the last 2 years?
Yes. So I'd love to just highlight a couple things based on our experience in the fund. Our highest valued company in our portfolio, and I can't share who they are yet because it's not public, is going to have a post-money valuation of $700 million. It's a digital health company. period. Our first significant exit was a digital health company called Citizen. We invested when they were valued at approximately $15 million. They exited for roughly $325 million in the order of 3 years, a digital health company. One of our portfolio companies, which is digital health, is merging with another one. So there's a lot of activity. Brooks Story brought this up. Some McKinsey data shows that from 2017 to 2021, telemedicine companies have telemedicine activity has increased by 38 times. VC money from 2017 to 2021 in digital health, 3x increase. And we just see it. The other interesting thing is the companies are raising larger rounds. A seed deal 3 years ago would be 2-3 million, well, 1 to 2 million. Now we're meeting companies. When we first meet them, they say, yeah, we're raising 3 million. They say, oh no, we found 2 lead investors. We're going to raise 10 million. I mean, there's so much capital in the market, period. Yeah.
No, for sure. And talking with Sandra Sadania yesterday, who was a finalist in your pitch contest and won the Medtech Innovator. They've only raised $2 million just through pitch contests and very non-dilutive capital. They're ready to go up for their seed money now. They already have $2 million behind them funding their efforts. So this is, these little businesses are getting some serious capital behind them and they need them. So it's great.
So my other contribution to this conversation was a series of slides that I got from John Norris of Silicon Valley Bank. John, of course, tracks healthcare financing, tracks medtech financing. So slides don't work so well in a podcast. So I thought I'd catch up with John Norris. We spoke about SVB's Q3 numbers. Let's listen. John Norris, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom. I'm always excited to be here.
Thank you again for the slides at the Medmarc meeting. They were very helpful. But as I said, I want to go right to the source and just understand some big takeaways from the first 3 quarters of 2021. Let's approach it at different stages. What sort of surprised you, and what's changing in the early stages?
On the early stage side, when you look at it over the last 3 years, you saw progressive actual downward action in terms of dollars invested into Series A companies, which was a little concerning because you think about, these are the companies that are going to be setting us up for the next round of really big, exciting companies. And if you're not seeing a lot of Series A activity, it's really concerning. But I do think in 2021, that changed. First half of the year, we're at a little bit more than 500 million invested in Series A, which put us on track to exceed what we saw in 2018 and definitely exceed 2019 and 2020. And then Q3 was actually a really big quarter, over 400 million invested into Series A in just that quarter. So we're at around $1 billion or more, which is really good to see. And I think if I think about Series A, I think about really 2 sectors that I think are most interesting. One, non-invasive monitoring continues, like sort of sensor-based technology, super interesting. A lot of that is focused on cardiovascular. And then the second one would be sort of on the neurostim side. But included in that is some interesting we saw this, Neuralink, which is sort of the Elon Musk company that raised a really huge round. Mm-hmm. But you've seen a couple other Series A companies in the brain-computer interface technology, which I thought super interesting, something to watch.
That's amazing. That's extraordinary. Yeah. Okay. We'll definitely watch that. Let's move into to later stages. What are you seeing there?
Yeah. And so later stage with a good Q3, we're actually at somewhere over $7 billion for the year for device, which again is a record for a year at Q3. So that's great. I think if there's one big takeaway there, it's just seeing so much capital that's non-traditional venture. And these are sort of the hedge funds, the private equity players, the late stage folks. A lot of them had been very successful on the biopharma side and maybe look to expand into other sectors. But this is your big source of capital for your Series C and your Series D. And you're seeing firms like D1 Capital and RA and Marshall Wace. And these are the sort of folks that are coming in. And this is actually, I think, one of the reasons why Series A is up is that you have this really extensive pool of late stage capital. And the late stage capital, I think, has obviously been driven by the ability for really interesting companies to go public. With the IPO market open, the later stage funds see this as an opportunity to get in early at a valuation that's, maybe better than what they would get at an IPO, but then being in that round allows them to be an existing investor and maybe get more in the IPO. So it's interesting to see. I think, if I think about the biggest deals being done in 2021, I would say, robotic surgery continues to be very, very big. And then, similar to Series A, neuro, but that's where you're starting to see a lot of these PE hedge funds folks, and you're seeing these rounds at $40 million plus.
Well, that leads us perfectly to our final point. We want to look at exits, M&A, IPOs, et cetera. So how's that looking?
Yeah, I would say maybe starting off with the other, which is the SPAC side. I think we're seeing, interesting activity there. Overall, almost all the SPACs that we're seeing in healthcare have traded down once they de-SPACed and started trading publicly in the market.
What is the de-SPAC? I saw the de-SPAC on the slide.
Oh, so SPAC is really you're announcing the intent to merge, and then when you actually consummate, you raise that money and you start getting traded publicly as this new entity. That's the de-SPAC.
Oh, all right.
So when you think about at de-SPAC, you think about the implied value when you announce the SPAC, and then you look at, okay, now you're actually trading in the public market. What does that look like? Almost everybody's trading down.
I see.
Kind of broadly across healthcare. Although I will say on the device side, in the second half, we've seen two pretty interesting de-SPACs. One, Vicarious Surgical, that was, the announced value a little bit over $1 billion. And I think it was trading at the end of October at like 1.6 billion in terms of value. So that's great to see.
Yep.
And then Humacyte was another one, announced value again, a little bit over $1 billion, and it's trading right around $1 billion. So those are two really interesting ones. And I think, the takeaway there is that at least you're raising a lot of capital. So even if you are trading down, you have time to sort of, make back the shareholder value, and you're out into the public market. So that's kind of on the de-SPAC side or the SPAC side. I think, what I look at, one, IPOs continue to be really strong. So as of sort of the end of October, I think we're around 15 IPOs, which is the biggest number that we've seen since 2015. And the second half IPOs have been pretty strong in terms of the pre-money valuations and the dollars raised. So it looks like the demand is really there. And I think it's a little bit mixed. You have three that are down about 20%, and then you have three that are up, one significantly in Procept. So good activity there. And I think that is, obviously it's good for the industry. And it's also exciting when you sort of take into account the private M&A that goes along with it. Because not only are we seeing really good activity on the IPO side, M&A is up too. And with the 5 M&A we've seen so far in the second half, I think we are at around 19 M&A for the year,
wow,
which puts us really close to 2015's record. And the dollar amount for upfront is up, and that's also exciting. But what's even more exciting, I think in my mind, is that you're seeing all these sort of small and mid-cap public companies that are coming in to acquire venture-backed device technologies. You see companies like NuVasive and C-Spine, Axonics, Hillrom, et cetera, coming in to acquire medical technologies from the venture side. All very exciting because it's not just your usual suspects. Usual suspects are still acquiring companies, but now you have another group of acquirers as well. And so that, with the IPO market and a lot of capital that's out there to be invested into medical technologies, means that I think device is really in a good place right now.
Fantastic. Well, outstanding information as always. John, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
You got it. Anytime.
Next, we're going to talk about the FDA. So Kwame Ulmer teaches at UCLA. He works with Jennifer McKinney, who heads the biomed program there. Together, they renewed a study that Josh Mackauer talked about on this podcast that he did about a decade ago of the FDA, a survey of medical device executives to understand exactly how the agency is treating medical device applications. So it's a considerable undertaking to understand just how things are going at the FDA. You may recall Josh Mackauer shared the origins of the survey that he did initially. It was came at the behest of a congresswoman, Anna Eshoo, who basically said, look, I want data to support your claims. And that's what the study provided. And the impact at the FDA has been considerable. This new study that Kwame will talk about will just show us how considerable that impact has been.
So I had been bugging. Jennifer McKinney is a leader in the healthcare ecosystem nationally, but really has a big presence in Southern California. She's a professor at UCLA. She runs their healthcare entrepreneurship program and the biodesign program, which is analogous to Stanford's biodesign program. So I've been talking to her about the Macauer study. And the Macauer study was one where Josh Macauer surveyed medtech companies in 2010 to ask their perceptions about the FDA. And we thought collectively, Jennifer McCaney, myself, and Christian Johnson, the investigators for this study, that there was an opportunity a decade later to not only ask about perceptions of the FDA, but ask questions about reimbursement. How do you feel about reimbursement? Look at quantitative data on how long it really takes to get through the FDA to see, quite candidly, if the reforms from Jeff Shuren had made an impact in perception and reality. And then ask new questions regarding digital health, the breakthrough designation program, the guaranteed 4 years of reimbursement. So it was an update, an enhanced update, and a more quantifiable look at the state of what it takes to get a medical device, digital health, or diagnostic company from concept to commercialization. And we have the initial data set in. We're analyzing it, and there's going to be a report put out in partnership with BCG. And we're going to go on a roadshow, Tom, and hopefully we can be a stop on your roadshow to share the results. But in a nutshell, we can now say with definitiveness how much it costs to take a 510K device from concept to commercialization. We can say with clarity how many months it takes. We can say with clarity, this is the perception of the industry of the role FDA plays. Are they a barrier, a burden in 2021? We can answer those questions now. We can also talk about perceptions of how difficult it is to get through the EU. And the main point of the reforms was to solidify the U.S. as the first place for innovators, medtech innovators, to run clinical trials and apply for marketing approval. So I'm excited to share this information. I think there will be some surprises and there will be some validation of the work and reforms, one way or the other, that have gone on in the U.S. and obviously all the reforms going on in the EU and how companies perceive it.
And then later on, I asked Kwame, who was still at the FDA at the time that Josh Macauer's first study came out, whether he remembers the impact of that study.
Vividly.
And what was it like seeing the data? Was it offensive? There
were two camps. I was so early so the two camps were in the FDA. Our process is fine. We make sure the products are safe. We don't really have a role in accelerating or helping innovators in any meaningful way. We are regulators. We make sure products are safe. And the culture at the FDA when I first started was there's a dual mandate, safety and effectiveness, but we had a bias towards asking all the questions you need to ask, whether they're 10 or 20, to make sure that product was safe. The reforms that were put in place put a more emphasis on effectiveness. There were these outside experts that came into the FDA and helped us rethink how we can more efficiently get through a review. And that ultimately, it was called the innovation pathway. That ultimately resulted in the breakthrough designation program. So there were a series of reforms that took place over those years. And now I think we're at a point, because of MDUFMA, we can look at the performance of the FDA, how many pre-submissions are going through, how many breakthrough designations are going through. De novo was a very opaque process. Now de novo is a standard process to get through the FDA. I would say 10 years ago, it was no man's land. You didn't know how long it was going to take. The perception was it was going to take almost as long as a PMA. And people really didn't want to be a de novo product. Now, people want to be a de novo product. They like the money. They like the clarity of the guidances that have come out. So I know we probably have to hit other things, but I'm excited about this research. And when I was at the FDA, it wasn't a Category 9 earthquake, but it was not a tremor. It was probably like a 5 inside. We kind of got shook up.
I'm from Massachusetts, so I know you're from LA, so those actually mean something to you, but I'm guessing 5's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah. 5 sounds big. Okay. Yeah. Don't want to deal with 9s. I know 9s are bad.
Right. 9s are bad.
What is your timeline for results from your data? And yes, we've got meetings in Boston in May.
Yeah.
Minnesota in June.
We actually
Santa Clara in October.
We actually want to announce this at JP Morgan.
Okay.
So January, second week in January, we're working through the report with BCG now. They've been a great partner, and hopefully we will. We also talk about the MSIT program, and hopefully we can have a positive impact on the discussion in the Biden administration about what to do about reimbursing for breakthrough designation products.
Right. Kwame mentioned that the survey will also cover reimbursement, and we could also cover that in our talk at Medmarc, specifically the Medicare coverage of innovation technology rule that came and went. It allowed for 4 years of reimbursement from Medicare for devices that secured breakthrough designation from the FDA. It's a huge boost for device investors, as Kwame said in the conversation, that he saw a number of companies moving toward breakthrough designation because that's where the money is. They were able to guarantee investors that if they got regulatory approval, they'd have Medicare reimbursement. And that's a huge deal. Unfortunately, that deal has gone by the wayside. The Biden administration is changing course. And to get an update on where we are with all this, because it seems to be an ever-changing story, I talked to Mark Leahy, the CEO of the Medical Design Manufacturers Association, MDMA. A lot of initials going on, but Mark's the best, and he gave us an update on what's going on with MSET. Let's listen. Mark Leahy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom. Good to be with you.
It's great to get an update on the Medicare coverage of innovation technology, the MSET rule. We've had a lot of back and forth on this. Take us back, if you would, to when it was first introduced. I had that happening in 2019, but was it not approved until 2021? Can you give us a little history?
This is something, an issue we've been working on for close to a decade now, trying to, narrow that gap between regulatory and reimbursement for innovative medical technologies. And it's had a few iterations. I think PACER was the first acronym, and then the Obama administration had an Excite proposal that was under review, got cleared by CMS, and then with the doc fix kind of was crowded out of the physician fee rule back, I think, in 2016. And then with the Trump administration came in, there was an effort to revisit, and ultimately there was a proposal under review at OMB for a little over a year, I think, and then ultimately the proposed rule was put out in September of 19, and the final rule was issued in January of 2020.
Give us just a quick description of what the rule does. The first one that came out in September of 2019.
So the proposed rule in September of 2019 would have provided automatic coverage for FDA-designated breakthrough devices for a 4-year period. The intent there is obviously to provide for these novel medical technologies that address unmet clinical needs, wanted to accelerate Medicare beneficiaries' access to them. So there would be an opportunity for Medicare beneficiaries not to have to wait many years to get access. In the interim, companies would collect data over that 4-year period to ultimately help inform a permanent coverage determination by CMS.
So where do we stand currently? I know there was some news that came out in September 21, and then we had some more news that came out this week. There's a lot of pages being turned. What's the status of MSET?
Sure. So the new administration came in, obviously paused all regulations and rules that weren't implemented, issued some additional rules seeking feedback, and ultimately what came out last week was very disappointing. Not necessarily surprising was that CMS was actually rescinding the previous rule, the MSIT rule, so that the MSIT 1.0 will not be moving forward. That rescission will officially take effect on December 15th. However, CMS has noted in a number of press releases and FR notices their desire to enhance and improve coverage for innovative medical technologies. They've indicated that there is a need here, potential for additional rulemaking. And I think what we remain optimistic about in talking both with professional staff there, but also I think health policy experts across the political spectrum, well-regarded folks like Mark McClellan and the team at Duke Margolis have come out and expressed support for an MCIT-like approach. There's overwhelming bipartisan support. You may have seen just this week, the Cures 2.0 legislation was introduced by Congresswoman DeGette and Congressman Upton, again, building off the overwhelming bipartisan support they had for the 21st Century Cures legislation in 2016. And one of the key provisions in Cures 2.0 is an MCIT-like approach. So again, what we remain optimistic about is the ongoing understanding that there are critical novel medical technologies out there that can absolutely improve patient care for Medicare beneficiaries, and we should be doing everything possible to narrow that gap between the regulatory and reimbursement landscape to ensure that these Medicare beneficiaries have timely access to these critical medical technologies.
The statement by CMS issued in September, it was stated that there was a concern that early adoption of breakthrough technologies by physicians could establish those breakthrough technologies to be the standard of care, and it could adversely impact beneficiaries. It seemed like there's a real hesitancy about giving quick approval or assuring reimbursement rather for approved devices. It sounded pretty definite in that statement. But it sounds to me that from you that there is an understanding that this some type of breakthrough designation is a positive. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think there's and again, I want to speak for CMS, but I think, in various, as you said, iterations and rules or comments they put out, there were certain things that they highlighted about the initial rule. For example, there was no requirement for data collection in order to qualify for MCIT. I think that's something that is, any of the companies we've talked to about this, we're going to be collecting data. And so if they wanted to have mandatory data collection for the purposes of qualifying for MCIT, I think that's, a reasonable refinement to make, ensuring that data set includes Medicare beneficiaries. I think that was another area where folks said, well, you could come to the market or get through FDA with no data at all on Medicare beneficiaries. And so how could you make a claim to have a benefit to Medicare beneficiaries? And I think, again, that's something that's a workable issue to address. The timing in which you inform CMS, I think CMS raised concerns that the previous rule allowed basically a company to knock on CMS's door the day of market authorization and have immediate coverage apply. And I think there's a recognition that just like with FDA, there should be an opportunity to interface, ask questions. So, these are some of the operational issues that CMS has raised in various settings. And, based upon the conversations we've had with our members and other stakeholders, I think they're all quite addressable. And from our perspective, though, as I said at the outset, this is a concept that's been well worn in different iterations, has bipartisan support, has been supported by Democrat and Republican administrations here. And what we don't want to have happen is to kick the can down the road. I did see in the Federal Register notice, the most recent, about 2 public meetings that CMS plans to take place in 2022. What we put in our most recent public comment was that, again, given the well-worn concept here, bipartisan support, that we urgently request CMS to move forward with an updated proposed rule, finalize that rule, and implement this MCIT 2.0 or MCIT-like approach by July 1st of 2022. We don't want this to continue in perpetuity because, quite frankly, Medicare beneficiaries, deserve better. I think innovators, investors, the healthcare system as a whole would benefit from these technologies. And again, not saying that the first iteration was perfect. There are refinements, as I just stated, that should be made and I think would be embraced by the overwhelming majority of all stakeholders. And we should just be working expeditiously to address these issues and move forward with an MCIT 2.0.
And just finally, you mentioned twice the bipartisan support. We saw a letter from Congress from 10 senators basically expressing support for timely creation of a new MCIT rule. And it was signed by, again, 10 senators, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, which in this time of partisan warfare, it seemed rather extraordinary to have such bipartisan support of a program. I guess that represents least the position of those 10 centers, but is there a broader support amongst the two parties for some kind of rule going forward?
That's a great point, Tom, and there absolutely is. You mentioned the bipartisan Senate letter, as you noted, in this environment when getting folks to agree on much is a challenge, but the Senate obviously expressed bipartisan support in that letter. And on the House side, there's actually a bill introduced by Congresswoman Del Bunny and Congresswoman Walorski called the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthrough Products Act of 2021, and effectively, again, would memorialize an MCIT-like approach. This actually has 14 Democratic sponsors and 8 Republican co-sponsors. So, again, I think both on the House and Senate side, you have multiple members across the aisle here that support moving forward with an MCIT-like approach. And so, again, I think that just demonstrates the broad bipartisan support. In one area, we talked about the process here a little bit, not getting caught in the weeds, but there were public comments multiple times that CMS put out the opportunity for public comment, both I believe in March and then again in about a couple months ago. And I think overall there were maybe call it 350 public comments to the docket, and well over 260, 70, 90+% of these comments from patient groups, from physicians, from innovators, from investors, all overwhelmingly endorsed CMS moving forward with MCIT. Not surprising, the private insurance companies were the biggest opponents of this. So again, this is something what you look at. The diverse set of stakeholders out there. There's only overwhelming support for this concept. Again, we're encouraged. CMS has publicly expressed interest in finding ways to improve and accelerate coverage for innovative medical technologies for Medicare beneficiaries, and we'll continue to work tirelessly until we have a workable program that stood up to meet the needs of all stakeholders.
That's great. And the primary opposition is coming from the insurance industry, or are there significant
Correct.
Opposition? Interesting.
That's right.
Wasn't aware of that.
They're not ones to usually want to embrace new technologies.
Great, Mark. Well, we'll appreciate the update. We'll continue to follow the story. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom.
We clearly covered a lot in this discussion, and the final point that we talked about were new tools and technology, how they were affected over the last 2 years, or how they grew over the last 2 years. We talked a bit about telemedicine, but really focused in on telesurgery. On this podcast, we've interviewed folks from Avail and Proximie and Explorer, and just really wanted to highlight how those companies have grown during the pandemic at a time when sales reps and surgeons couldn't get into hospitals or into ORs. So to illustrate the point of how telesurgery has been impacted over the last 2 years, I contacted Jennifer Freed. She is co-founder and CEO of Explorer Surgical. Explorer recently was acquired in quite an interesting deal that really should put it front and center in front of a lot of medical device companies. Let's listen. So Jennifer, tell us about the origins of Explorer Surgical. What led you to create the company and co-found the company and create the product?
Absolutely. Well, Explorer started out of a research lab at the University of Chicago Medical Center. It's founded by Dr. Alex Langerman in 2011. He's a head and neck surgeon and also an academic researcher that was focused on studying operating room workflow and operating room efficiency, or the lack thereof, as we like to joke. And he really founded it based on his own experience, where he saw a lot of variability in what happens in the OR and procedure suites, with a lot of it really being driven by who was showing up to support a particular case and how many different types of procedures and products and new techniques were being used in that room. And so I met Alex in 2013 when I went back to graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I've been working as a healthcare investor in Silicon Valley, investing in early stage medtech and early stage healthcare IT. And I had personally never spent any time in the operating room. And so when Alex started describing some of the operational hiccups to me of, moments where he'd reach out his hand during a case and they wouldn't have the right instrument or something wasn't ready, and he'd literally, be sitting there twiddling his thumbs for a couple minutes with a patient up and on the table, I honestly didn't believe him. And so Alex invited me then into the OR, very shortly after that. And I started spending time with him and seeing it for myself. And that's where I just became really fascinated with OR workflow and efficiency. And we started collaborating on research. And ultimately, a couple of years later, we spun the concepts out of the university, incorporated, and started building a product.
How did 2020, the pandemic, how did that change things for Explorer? You clearly were in a right place at the right time. Did it accelerate a plan that was happening? Did you pivot to take advantage of a previously unforeseen opportunity? What happened then?
I mean, I would say it really accelerated things for us, and it's such a shame that for the reason why. But, prior to 2020, I think medtech companies were really excited to work with us. But, we were still seen by a lot of different groups within medtech as a nice to have versus a must have. Mm-hmm. So, thinking about digital technology, thinking about, remote access, all of these things made sense well before 2020, right? But until, what I say, the impractical became impossible, mm-hmm. That's what really drove change for the industry. And so for us, 2020 was a massive market accelerant. I mean, our business grew, about 6 times over 2019. Wow. Overnight, all of a sudden, we couldn't keep up with demand and interest. And so, I think it's a silver lining of a really awful situation that you started to see the industry that's often been very slow to adopt new technology really embrace digital and embrace change and look for new solutions and new technology.
Well, as we emerge from the pandemic, hopefully, it's clear though that the changes that came last year aren't changing back, at least not completely. And I think your recent acquisition is an indication of that. Tell us about the deal and what does it mean for Explorer going forward?
Yeah, we're really excited to be a GHX company. And so, for us, as a result of the acquisition, I mean, nothing's changing day to day for, our existing customers. We're going to continue working with medtech companies. We're continue working with providers that we work with. And, what's really exciting about this and what gives me a lot of confidence that we found the right home for our product and the right home for our team and what we're doing for the industry is really the history of GHX. GHX was founded just over 20 years ago by a set of the largest medtech companies that came together and said, we're all facing similar challenges, and we need an industry solution that uses enterprise software to help us solve how we work with providers. And, their initial goal that they set out to tackle was in supply chain, which is very relevant to what we do. Mm-hmm. Although most of what they're looking at is outside of the operating room, but it really comes down to their core mission of connecting providers with medtech companies through best-in-class software solutions. And so they are working with virtually every major med device company and every provider. So they have an existing customer base. That's the exact group that we're working with. But it's really their approach to connecting these different stakeholders within healthcare, through software that I'm really, really excited about. And so I think for us, this is going to enable us to grow even faster than we were growing as a standalone company, which was quite fast. But also I'm excited for our team to be able to learn a lot of their best practices and apply what they've been doing in enterprise software so well for the past 2 decades and apply that to our team.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad you were there to help the medical device companies when they needed it, and I'm glad your future is somewhat more secure with the acquisition. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. Absolutely, thank you for having me, Tom. Well, that is a wrap of this very, very unique episode of the Device Talks Weekly podcast. Thanks again to Medmarc for having me out in Vegas for their brokers meeting. Thanks again to my most excellent guest and partner on stage, Kwame Ulmer of Ulmer Ventures. It was a terrific talk. I'm glad we could share some of it with you here on the podcast. Very happy that Jennifer and John and Mark made themselves available to sort of help me illustrate the points that I made on stage. So I hope we've provided you with just some things to think about as we begin, believe it or not, to think about the new year. Once again, thanks again to Medmarc for having me out there and for sponsoring this podcast episode. If you'd like to find out more information about Medmarc, you can go to medmarc.com. That's Medmarc with a C. If you want to learn more about Medtech Color and contribute to their very important work, go to medtechcolor.org. And of course, if you want to find me, I am on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn and on Twitter at MedTechTom. Once again, that is a wrap. If you'd like to find more episodes of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast, you can go to devicetalks.com. You can also learn about our events and other podcasts there as well. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Google, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and most major podcast applications. That's it. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast.